Well, this is it. The Brussels sprout. That's Brussels, plural, sprout, because of the location Brussels. But this vegetable really has an unfortunate reputation. And before we get into the review proper, I guess I just want to sort of address that a little bit because, growing up, at least when I was a kid, I don't know if people really cook Brussels sprouts anymore. But they were always, the bane of children's existence. Children famously, they don't want to eat their vegetables, but the vegetable they don't want to eat the most is the Brussels sprout. And because of that, I have a couple here. Is people, they've sort of taken on a life of their own, that people, they just don't want to try them. And I was sort of almost looking forward to doing this because they're so out of circulation. If you go to a restaurant, asparagus is something I really don't like at all. But if you go to a restaurant, asparagus is reasonably common, especially if it's like a more upper class, fine dining sort of restaurant. But Brussels sprouts, you don't really see them anywhere. They've just disappeared off the map because they have this infamous, this terrible reputation. So part of the reason I was sort of wanted to do this review is to look at that, to address it, to think, are these really as bad as people are making out? I mean, the other reason, if you saw before, is I also have these red Brussels sprouts, which are interesting because I've never seen those before, only recently. So we'll have those. We'll try out both varieties. There are multiple varieties of Brussels sprouts, like multiple varieties of red, multiple varieties of green, but I don't think it really matters that much. Some people will be very picky about potatoes, let's say, because there are sort of two ways of looking at potatoes. You have the white potatoes, you have red potatoes, blue potatoes. But within red potatoes, let's use red potatoes as an example. People just usually think of red potatoes, but within red potatoes, you've got different varieties like Desiree or Ruby Lou potatoes, let's say. And it's the same with Brussels sprouts, but people, they just want like that one sort of category. They just want red potatoes. They're not fussed really about, generally speaking, about what kind of red potatoes. And it's like that with Brussels sprouts. If somebody, strangely, in today's age, might want Brussels sprouts, they're just going to go for Brussels sprouts. They're not going to say, hey, is this whatever variety of Brussels sprouts? And so moving on to the question of why is this? Why do Brussels sprouts have such a terrible reputation? Assuming it's not just because of their taste, because they taste so supremely awful. We'll get to the taste testing in a bit and see if that's really the case. But I think, growing up, I don't know if this is that common an experience. My mother could cook quite well, so this wasn't that common for me. Not that I had Brussels sprouts, because people, they don't like Brussels sprouts. Myself, I'm sure I was no different as a child. But growing up, going to friends' houses, and this isn't to disparage them, but it's quite a common thing. It's it's a joke, it's a meme on the internet now to say that like white people don't season their food, and that's not to say that there's nothing to be said with simple, plainly cooked food, because you don't need to just throw spices on everything to unlock its flavors. But a lot of the time, people just wouldn't do anything. They wouldn't even use salt and pepper. Their mashed potatoes, they'd just be boiled and mashed, no cream, no butter. And that was an experience I think a lot of people had growing up. I'm not sure why. I'm not sure if it's just because of the prevalence of cooking shows and cooking as a culture that's become more focused on taste and developing that, as opposed to in the past where people might not have had so much availability of spices and everything. But it's always been the case, with European, Western English cooking in particular is very plain, not many spices, just plain, very simple food. So growing up, Brussels sprouts, if you don't do anything with them, and this is the case with fruits and vegetables and all sorts of foods, if you don't do anything with them, they're just not very exciting. they're not very fun to eat. And whether we want to talk about food as something that should be fun to eat or not, that's really the sort of environment we exist in now, where people, where it almost seems nonsensical to say, but when people go out and they want to buy something to eat, they want a meal, they want it to taste good. That's the main focus, rather than in the past where it just would have been, hey, I'm having something to eat so I don't feel hungry, so I have something to eat. So the food is a function of necessity, not of pleasure, which is what it is nowadays. You have so much dedicated to just explosions of flavor. So I'm just going to take a quick look at Brussels sprouts in this review to really sort of look at whether that reputation is justified, whether you want to go out and try some Brussels sprouts for yourself. Probably not, but that's the way it is with a lot of childhood trauma, I should say. But before we get into the tasting of the Brussels sprouts, most people will notice that if you look at them, they look quite a lot like cabbage. Obviously very small. And if you pick up a whole cabbage, usually when you go to the store, it's already the bottom has already been sort of trimmed up, so it looks a bit nicer. But if you ever go to a market or something maybe, and you pick up a whole cabbage, you'll find on the bottom of the stem there'll be little sprouts, and they'll almost look quite a bit like Brussels sprouts, maybe a bit bigger. And that's because Brussels sprouts, kale, cabbage, cauliflower, there are a few others like collard greens, broccoli. They all come from originally the same plant. I mean, that's not to say, when we talk about the way things are grown, that's not to say, when we're growing cabbage, we just have this crazy thing, this monstrosity of a plant where it's got cauliflower on one side, it's got kale on the other, and it's all just sticking out everywhere. No, if you look at Brussels sprouts being grown, it's grown on almost like a big, huge corn cob, but instead of the corn kernels, it's Brussels sprouts. It's this big spire with Brussels sprouts sticking out, and cabbage is grown separately, kale is grown separately. So because we've selectively bred to grow that particular aspect of wild cabbage originally, I think we've grown just so the bud grows, which would grow into the cauliflower or whatever like that. And that's how we've come to Brussels sprouts. And those are all members of the cruciferous, or they're all classified as cruciferous vegetables. People tend to think as green, but we've got red cabbage here, red Brussels sprouts. Just like I think the red Brussels sprouts were made by breeding normal Brussels sprouts with red cabbage. And those, because they're all part of that same family, that's what, if you ever read the term cruciferous vegetable, that's what it refers to. Kale, cauliflower, broccoli, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, all that sort of stuff. So that's why, I mean, in this review, I might refer to cabbage a bit, because that's the immediate comparison. Most people, even if they've avoided Brussels sprouts their entire life, they've probably had cabbage. And that's the thing, Brussels sprouts have sort of taken on this life of their own, where people will instinctively avoid them for their entire life, never having tasted them, because they've just got such a terrible reputation. They don't even want to look at them. So we're going to dive right in here. I hope this is a interesting experience as it is for me, because I've definitely never had the red ones, and it's been many years since I had a green Brussels sprouts as well. So we're going to dive right in here. We'll start with the red one, I think, because if there's any difference, I think I recognize the taste of Brussels sprouts just normally if I tasted them, but I might not with the red cabbage, red Brussels sprouts. They're very dense. So I'm sorry if this takes too long of you just sitting here watching me chew. But moving on to the green one. You know, it's funny because this isn't actually the first time I've had Brussels sprouts since I was a child. You know, maybe like 4 or 5 years ago, you know, I was in the store and I went past the Brussels sprouts and I thought, you know what? I haven't had Brussels sprouts, much like I said at the start of this video, I haven't had Brussels sprouts in quite some time. Are they really as bad as people think of them? And I just grabbed one and popped it into my mouth, just like I did then, just like you do with a grape. And you know what? At the time, I thought, yeah, that was pretty bloody awful. That's just as awful as people think of them as. But sitting here now, and I don't know if it's just because I've matured or maybe I'm coming into this with a bit more of an open mind, but it's not particularly awful, you know. A few months ago, I used to eat a quarter of a cabbage or maybe half a cabbage every single day without fail, just raw. I wouldn't cook it or anything. I just eat it raw, you know, like a snack. Just the whole thing, just bite into it. And I've sort of moved on to spinach, replaced the cabbage with spinach from now. But this is, you know, obviously this is very similar to a cabbage, and it's very reminiscent sort of in a lot of ways, you know. Obviously it's very dense. You're not holding them in your hand like I am, but I mean, they're still fine, you know. They're very dense. There's a lot to chew on there. They've even got, there's that classic cabbage flavor, and the same as with the cabbage, they've even got that little undertone of spice as you bite into it, which you don't really expect from cabbage, but is there. It's not really, I'm not sure what people think of when they think of Brussels sprouts, but I think it's a kind of like underlying, just unpleasant sort of mild bitterness under the Brussels sprouts. And I don't know if these are particularly good ones. You want to get them sort of later. I think Brussels sprouts are they mainly are cultivated or come to their season is more in autumn, in fall, I think. And I think you sort of want to get them to the late end of that season. So I'm not sure if these are particularly good ones, because we're in winter now here at least. So I'm not sure if those are particularly good ones or what, but it wasn't that unpleasant, I have to say. It wasn't that bad at all. Now, to further this review, obviously when people talk about Brussels sprouts, when people eat Brussels sprouts on the very rare occasion that they do, they're not talking about just grabbing a handful like they were peanuts or something and just eating them like that, like I just did. People cook with them, obviously, like one does with most vegetables. So here, I've done the same. I've got one that's just been, I don't know how well this is going to show up, but like, I've just chucked that into the oven for 20 to 40 minutes, something like that, till there's a bit of, you know, your fork goes in quite easily, you know, it's not as hard. There's a bit of char on the outside. That's lovely. And for this other one, I've just done that on the stove where it's very soft. Perhaps I should have left the ones in the oven for a bit longer. But I've just done these on the stove, on the fry pan, and there's nothing special really about, especially the ones I did in the oven. It's only just olive oil, salt and pepper. That's it. But the ones that I did on the stove, there was Same, the olive oil, the salt, the pepper, but I also did some onions and some garlic, and I put some. I'd cooked some chicken earlier, and I'd used the leftover chicken juices to sort of baste these with. Now this isn't the only way that you can cook Brussels sprouts. Obviously, you can stir fry with them, you can slow cook with them, you can boil them, you can braise them. You can probably steam them, I think. But, for the purposes of keeping this review reasonably short, we're not going to run through, this isn't a cooking channel, we're not going to run through every single possible way you could cook Brussels sprouts and how they come out. I've just done these couple of ways to sort of demonstrate them. If you're interested, you can Google different ways to cook Brussels sprouts, what flavors they go with, so you get a bit of a more varied experience, something that might be a bit more tailored towards your taste. So again, we're just going to taste these, and I'll run through a bit of the benefits maybe of eating Brussels sprouts and how these came out. Hopefully pretty good. I mean, I hope so. I'm the one that's got to eat them, but okay. So we'll start with a green roasted one that's just been done in the oven. I really think they should have gone for a bit more, but we're here now, never mind. We'll do a red one now. I mean, one thing I forgot to mention is that the red ones, like a red cabbage, is also quite a bit smaller than the green ones. So that's one thing to keep in mind if you do happen to pick up red Brussels sprouts. They'll probably cook a bit quicker. But going in. Now for the fried ones with the bit of garlic and onion and chicken. Okay, well, I think once you start, my sense here, my intuition is telling me that once you start to cook the Brussels sprouts, that underlying bit of pleasant spiciness that is in them when there's raw sort of goes away, and you really want to cook them all the way through, which I don't think I quite managed to do with the roasted ones, because once that spice goes away, there's a bit of that unpleasant Brussels sprouts flavor that people really associate with Brussels sprouts underneath, and once you cook them through, like on the ones that I did on the stove, those came out nice and soft. So when you cook Brussels sprouts, what you're really looking for, see, these are quite still a little bit hard, not as hard as the raw ones, obviously, but you want your fork to go through quite easily. That's how you know they're done, right? And that's maybe not the case with the Brussels sprouts, but that is the case, however, with the ones that I've done on the stove, where they're quite soft. The individual leaves of the Brussels sprouts just sort of pop out. They've loosened up, and that underlying horrible Brussels sprouts taste that people really dislike about Brussels Brussels sprouts has gone away, and it's given rise to the more versatile base of the Brussels sprout. You know, typically when people use cabbage, they might use the leaves. Well, obviously they use the leaves, but they might use the whole leaves to put stuff in, or they might chop it up. Whereas Brussels sprouts, because they're in such a nice bite-sized size, they're used as more of a dense filler in the dish itself, because you know, you don't have to really chop them up really fine or anything, because they're already pretty much bite-sized. You just chop them in half if you're going to do them a lot. Not if you're going to boil them, because then they get really soft, but if you're going to fry them, you chop them in half, and then you're pretty much good to go. They're the perfect size already, so they can really serve as more of a dense filling in the dish, and to soak up all those flavors, as opposed to cabbage, which, you know, you chop up and then you've got the leaves that have been chopped, or it's not as large a piece that makes up the dish, I guess I'm trying to say. So I'm pleasantly surprised with these ones that I've fried. I might give the oven ones another go. I've got some leftover Brussels sprouts. I might just leave them in there for a bit longer until they get nice and soft, because that's really what I think you want when you're going for Brussels sprouts, for them to get nice and soft, squishy, you know, so they can really soak up and not be too... They can really soak up all the flavors that you want, and they're not going to be too horrible to eat, because that underlying flavor that's so unpleasant just goes away, and you're just left with like a pleasant medium for soaking up whatever else you might use. And you know, there's that little tiny bit of cabbage taste that is not at all unpleasant that you get underneath, well, that you get when you eat the Brussels sprout. Obviously that's more or less what it is. It's just a tiny cabbage. Okay, so I'm quite surprised with how these turned out. One thing you might want to do, I had planned to do this because to just squeeze some lemon juice on there, but I didn't actually end up really needing it. I mean, I'll just give it a go now, but I mean, it smells lovely. But yeah, that citric acid from the lemon and the softness that really sort of breaks down the Brussels sprout a bit more. The flavors complement each other well. I'm pleasantly surprised. You know, if somebody brought me a bag of Brussels sprouts and said, "Hey, you want these Brussels sprouts? They're yours, completely for free," I wouldn't kick them out anymore. You know, I finally feel like they have a place in the world. So I'm pleasantly surprised with how these have come out. I might try, you know, as I said, the oven way another time, see if it comes out a bit better. But no, that was good. That was good. The benefit of doing it in the oven is you get that bit of char on the outside, which sort of complements the flavors a little bit, which is nice. Personally, I mean, people talk about, I think, again, going back to people's childhood, you know, a lot of things were boiled back then, Brussels sprouts as well. And when you boil things like that, especially for me, the texture is just really horrible to eat. So that can't have been a good factor for praising the Brussels sprouts in people's minds. You know, when you boil things like that, it just really breaks down. It's just not nice to eat. Takes out all the flavor. But no, roasting it in the oven, doing it on the cooktop, has turned out well. I'm pleasantly surprised. So the last thing we really want to talk about is why you want to eat Brussels sprouts. You know, they've got this horrible reputation. They might not come out right, and they've got this horrible flavor that people think about. Why would I even bother? Why would I eat a Brussels sprout ever? You know? Well, Brussels sprouts, I mean, people always say, right? They always say, hey, you've got to eat your fruits and vegetables. You've got to eat, and everybody knows, well, you know, obviously fruits and vegetables are healthy. They don't really know why. They just know that they are. And that's not really helpful for anybody, I think, telling somebody, hey, eat your fruits and vegetables. And I think that can really be a contributing factor in society. People, they don't know how good they could optimize their diet and how they would feel by the end of it, or how good they would feel by the end of it, because that information is just really not given to them. They know that eating fruits and vegetables is something that they should do, but they don't really know why. They don't know the consequences of not doing it. It's just something that's been told to them, so they figure it must be good, right? Well, this might not really go any way to explaining why that is, but Brussels sprouts, typically, just like most fruits and vegetables, you get your vitamin C, huge amount of vitamin C actually in Brussels sprouts. Most of your recommended daily intake, which, the validity of that is sort of up in the air, but if you do get enough that your recommended daily intake is satisfied, you're not going to be deficient in it, at least. We can say that. So vitamin C, you get vitamin K, which isn't that common. That's good for, your bone health. It also, so you get the vitamin K, good for bone health, good for blood clotting. And the one thing I wanted to mention, which I'm more informed about, is that cruciferous vegetables. You remember at the start of the video, we talked about cruciferous vegetables. They're all from the same wild cabbage family of cauliflower, kale, collard greens, Brussels sprouts, cabbage, broccoli. Those are all called cruciferous vegetables, as opposed to spinach, which, it's a green leafy vegetable, and that's what we tend to call it. We call it a leafy vegetable. It's not part of the cruciferous family. Well, the advantage of cruciferous vegetables, at least if this is something you're looking for, is that they're anti-estrogenic. So in today's world, there's a lot of foreign influences on our body, without going too far into it. But if you're really worried about your estrogen levels, pick yourself up some cabbage, some kale, some Brussels sprouts. If I will be recommending Brussels sprouts, but at the end of the day, it's up to you whether you want to go and get them. Just get some of those, and those will work to inhibit estrogen production and in your body, which theoretically may lead to high testosterone production, though not necessarily. So with that out of the way, Brussels sprouts, much to be praised for, really. And I think it's really worth just going out there. People have this much maligned image of Brussels sprouts. I think it's really worth challenging those perceptions, really revisiting them if you haven't for a while, and sort of trying something new, trying to broaden your horizon. So Brussels sprouts, I reckon, I maybe wouldn't go this far on an objective scale, but just because it's been such a pleasant surprise for me, and just because I would now, when I go to the store, I just would not reject Brussels sprouts out of hand anymore. I'd maybe go for, say, a 7.45. And I think that's going to just about cover it for today. I think the next review will be cauliflower, I think was the next nominated. I hope you enjoyed it. This has been quite a long one, but have a wonderful day.